First comment, I am going to keep to my title. And hopefully there'll be an outline coming up on the screen. This subject is highly relevant to the theme of this conference because a conflict which was originally Israeli-Palestinian quickly became Israeli-Arab and in recent years has become Israeli-Islamic. And it looks as if the Arab Spring is turning into an Islamic summer. Since this is a very complex and sensitive subject, we need to begin by defining our terms. What do we mean by radical Islam? At its simplest, we're talking about Muslims who are politically active in order to pursue a clearly Islamic agenda of some kind. So we're talking about Hamas, Islamic Jihad and Hezbollah, and we're also talking about the Muslims who are in government in Tunisia and Turkey. And we're talking about the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, who are relatively moderate and have even included Christians within their party, and about the Salafis, who have a much more hardline Islamic agenda, even talking about putting Christian Copts back into the position of dhimmis. It's important to recognize that only a limited number of them believe that violence is justified to achieve their goals. The majority of these Muslims do not believe in using violence and want to use peaceful and in many cases democratic means to reach their goals. In the past, we've talked about Islamic fundamentalism and Muslim fundamentalists, but Muslims have never liked the word fundamentalist being applied to them because it was coined in a Western Christian context, the USA, at the beginning of the 20th century, and they feel it doesn't fit in an Islamic context. Another term that has been used is political Islam, which is quite helpful because it emphasizes the political element. One of the commonest words that is used is extremist, but I suggest we should be cautious about using it because it is full of value judgments and not many people would like to call themselves extremist. Most people in the media and the academic world today, therefore, use the terms Islamism and Islamist. So in what follows, I'm going to speak most of the time about Islamism and Islamist. And what I'm offering here, and Sammy will be delighted, I'm offering 10 simple or perhaps not so simple steps to understanding and responding as Christians to Islamism in the world today. So first of all, we need to try to see ourselves as others see us. In October 2001, just a month after 9/11, an American journalist, Paul Kennedy, wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal. It was his way of trying to help fellow Americans to see themselves as most of the Muslim world sees them. This is what he wrote. How do we appear to them? And what would it be like were our places in the world reversed? Suppose that there existed today a powerful, unified Arab Muslim state that stretched from Algeria to Turkey and Arabia, as there was 400 years ago, the Ottoman Empire. Suppose this unified Arab Muslim state had the biggest economy in the world and the most effective military. Suppose, by contrast, this United States of ours had split into 12 or 15 countries with different regimes, some conservative and corrupt. Suppose that the great Arab Muslim power had its aircraft carriers cruising off our shores, its aircraft flying over our lands, its satellites watching us every day. Suppose that it's Sorry, I can't see my text. I can't see my text. Suppose that its multinational corporations had reached into North America to extract oil and paid the corrupt conservative governments big royalties for that. Suppose that it dominated all international institutions like the Security Council and the IMF. Suppose that there was a special state set up in North America 50 years ago of a different religion and language to ours, and the giant Arab Muslim power always gave it support. Suppose the colossus state was bombarding us with cultural messages about the status of women, about sexuality, that we found offensive. Suppose it was always urging us to change, to modernize, to go global, to follow its example. In those conditions, would not many Americans steadily grow to loathe that colossus, wish it harm, and perhaps try to harm it? I think so. Do you get the point? And dare I ask, do the Americans among us get the point? Secondly, we need to ask, why are they so angry, and do they have good reason to be angry? Having been born in India and lived there for the first 6 years of my life, and having lived and worked for 18 years in different parts of the Middle East, I think I have begun to understand a little of the anger that led to 9/11 and that is still felt today by many Muslims all over the world, and Arab Muslims in particular. They are angry at the way the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has dragged on for so many years and not been resolved on the basis of international law. They are angry about the way Kashmir, with its Muslim majority, has been treated by India since the creation of Pakistan. They are angry about the brutalization of Chechnya by successive Russian governments. They are angry that, since the end of the old imperialisms, the Muslim world has been so weak economically, politically, and militarily, and that the new kinds of imperialism allow the West to dominate all world bodies and control world trade. They are angry at the way so many governments in Muslim majority countries have not followed Islamic principles and have become so secular and corrupt. Many Islamists are just as angry with their own Muslim leadership as they are with the West. I have to say that if I were a Muslim, if I were an Arab, I would feel some of this anger. And as I look on from outside, I would have to say that I do understand why they have been so angry, and would have to add that in many cases, I believe they have good reason to be angry. 3, let's appreciate that there is a battle for the soul of Islam, a battle between different kinds of Muslims. Think back to 9/11 and the different ways in which Muslims responded to those terrible events. There were basically 3 different responses. 1, those who said these were genuinely Islamic actions carried out against the enemies of Islam in accordance with Islamic teaching. One of the hijackers had written before his death, "Remember the battle of the Prophet against the infidels," as he went on building the Islamic State. Secondly, those who said, these actions cannot possibly be justified in terms of Islamic teaching. Zaki Badawi of the Muslim College in London made this statement 2 days after 9/11. Those who plan and carry out such acts are condemned by Islam, and the massacre of thousands, whoever perpetrated it, is a crime against God as well as humanity. And thirdly, we sympathize with their motives, but can neither support nor condemn their actions. Many Muslims on the streets in different countries were caught in a dilemma because they could understand the thinking of the hijackers and shared some of their anger. They had some sympathy with them, but couldn't bring themselves either to condemn or approve of their actions. The expression battle for the soul of Islam comes from John Esposito, an American Christian Islamic scholar. He uses it to describe the intensity of the struggle that is going on within the Muslim world. It's important, therefore, for us to understand that many of the Muslims around us are strongly opposed to the ideology and actions of fellow Muslims who are Islamists, and especially those who are prepared to use violence. 4. Let's try to understand the different ways Muslims interpret the Quran. If we want to understand how Muslims use their scriptures to justify their ideology, we need first to appreciate something about the life of Muhammad. For them, the most significant event in the life of the Prophet, apart from the receiving of the Quran, was the Hijr, the migration from Mecca to Medina. Before this event in 622 AD, Muhammad had been a persecuted prophet in Mecca with a small group of disciples. But when he moved to Medina, he became the leader of the whole community and established the first Islamic state. He made the laws and led them into battle. Now he was both prophet and statesman. Religion and state, deen wa dawla, were closely bound together, and for many Muslims, this first Islamic state in Medina represents a golden age, and they look back to it as an ideal that they would like to recreate wherever they are today. So, if we ask why many Muslims are so politically motivated, one of the main reasons is that they are trying to follow the example of the Prophet. Then we also need to look at some of the verses in the Quran which sound very warlike. For example, 2:190. And fight for the cause of Allah those who fight you. Kill them wherever you find them. Fight them until there is no sedition and the religion becomes that of Allah. And 9:5. Then when the sacred months are over, kill the idolaters wherever you find them. If I had time, I would also want to look at the Quranic verses about the Jews, some of which are very hostile. Now, how do different kinds of Muslims interpret and apply verses like these? There are two principles of interpretation that they use. The first principle emphasizes the importance of understanding the original context in the life of the Prophet in which a particular revelation was given, known as Asbab and Nuzul, the occasions of revelation. The relevance and application of particular Quranic verses today should therefore be determined by the similarity between the original context of the revelation and the situation that Muslims find themselves in today. So, if Muslims in the West feel that they are in a totally different situation from that of the Muslim community in Medina, they would argue that verses commanding warfare are not relevant to them today. On the other hand, Muslims who do feel that they are under attack from the non-Muslim world, as much as the Medinan Muslims were, could easily feel that the warlike verses do apply to them today. The second principle of interpretation, abrogation, nasakh, suggests that an earlier revelation can be abrogated or cancelled out by a later revelation. Many Islamists would argue, therefore, that the earlier Quranic revelations in which the Prophet is urged to endure opposition patiently are cancelled out by the later revelations which allow or command the use of force to resist opposition. This can therefore be used to provide scriptural justification for violent confrontation in similar situations today. So, both moderates and Islamists are appealing to principles of interpretation which have been used by Muslim scholars for centuries. I suggest we need to be careful of trying to tell Muslims how to interpret their scriptures. We should be willing to listen to how they interpret their scriptures. 5. We need to see that every situation is different and try to understand each one in its own terms. Islamists in different countries do have many of the same convictions. Ideologues like Maududi in Pakistan and Sayyid Qutb in Egypt have been extremely influential throughout the Muslim world. At the same time, it's vital to understand the special circumstances in every country and the particular challenges to which Muslims have been responding. Hamas grew out of the Muslim Brotherhood in Gaza in 1987 as a response to the Israeli occupation, which had begun in 1967. Hezbollah came into being in Lebanon in the mid-1980s as a response to the Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon after the invasion of 1982. In Syria, the Muslim Brotherhood became the main focus of opposition to the regime of Hafez al-Assad, and they were punished very brutally by the massacre in Hama exactly 30 years ago. So generalizations about Islamism can be dangerous, and while we try to understand the mindset of Islamists, we must appreciate the special situations in each country. 6. Let's recognize that the Islamic dimension of the Palestinian conflict has grown gradually in response to particular situations. In my presentation at the conference 2 years ago, I tried to make the following points. 1, there are strong similarities between Islamic fundamentalism and Jewish fundamentalism. We might almost say that fundamentalism in the Palestinian context has been a carbon copy of Jewish fundamentalism. 2, Islamism in the Palestinian context has developed gradually over the years. 3, this development has to be understood in the context of the occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, and Lebanon. I would dare to suggest that if Israel had complied with the famous UN Resolution 242 in 1967, Hamas might never have come into existence. And if Israel had not invaded Lebanon in 1982, there might be no Hezbollah today. 4, terrorism and suicide bombings have been an expression of despair. If you believe your own leaders have let you down, if the whole Arab world has let you down, if the EU, the USA, and the UN have let you down, where else do you have to turn? And if, in addition, your religious teachers promise you instant, guaranteed access to paradise, what's to stop you blowing yourself up? So, Islamism in the Palestinian context has not come into being in a vacuum. It has been a response to something very specific. There are some very special reasons why it has developed in this context. 7, let's recognize that radicals are capable of changing their minds and being pragmatic. Let me give 2 examples. The original constitution of Hamas contained 36 different articles, most of which were based on Quranic verses or sayings of the Prophet. If you look on the Hamas website today, you will probably not find the constitution. Why? Because its leaders soon became embarrassed by its strong polemical character and started being much more sophisticated in their rhetoric. The articles on their website today are much more moderate. Khalid Haroub, in a study of Hamas, has written, what Hamas has resigned itself to do thus far is to let the charter die on its own, moving on and leaving it behind, hoping it will just go away. Rashid Ghannouchi, the Islamist leader of the new government in Tunisia, said and wrote some very strong things while he was in exile in Britain. But now that he and other Islamists are actually running the government, they know that they have to be much more pragmatic and perhaps less idealistic than they were before. So, for example, I understand that they have said that because the tourism industry is so important for the economy of the country, they will not ban bikinis on the beach or the sale of alcohol. You can say certain things when you're in opposition, but when you're in a position of power, everything changes and you're faced with very specific challenges. And in making difficult decisions, you sometimes have to be very pragmatic. Dare I say that perhaps the rest of the world needs to be more patient and give Islamists time to show whether they can run a modern state and put bread on the table. 8, we should see Iran as a special case. I feel I have to say something about Iran because of all the recent talk about its attempts to create nuclear power and nuclear weapons, and about a possible Israeli and/or American attack on Iran. These recent developments have changed the dynamic of the Palestinian issue very significantly in recent months. I read recently that Netanyahu, long before coming to power, said that, quote, Israel's date with destiny lay with Iran, not with the Palestinians. Let me make two brief comments. Firstly, Sunni Arabs are really scared about the growing arc of Shiite power linking Iran, the Shiite majorities in Iraq and Bahrain, the Alawite regime in Syria, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and Sunni Hamas in Palestine. Sunni Shiite tensions are growing. Secondly, the Islamic Republic of Iran shouldn't be identified too closely with Sunni Islamism. Iran is a special case for several reasons. They are Persians who have never shown much love for the Arabs. They're Shiites, not Sunnis. Their political philosophy, which is based on the idea of the guardianship of the legal scholar, Vilayat al-Faqih, is novel even for Shiites and is not likely to be copied elsewhere in the Muslim world. And lastly, there has been a very complicated relationship between Iran and the USA and Britain. All of these factors make Shiite Islam in Iran different in certain important respects from Islamism in other Middle Eastern contexts. Let me also remind you that those of us who come from the West have a special responsibility for the way recent history has unfolded in Iran. In 1953, the CIA and MI6 engineered a coup in order to bring down the first democratically elected government in Iran under Mossadegh. This coup led to the return of the Shah, and his dictatorial regime led to the return of Ayatollah Khomeini and the creation of the Islamic Republic in 1979. Again, do you get the point? 9. We need to be passionate about justice and injustice. Let me give you two contemporary examples of justice issues in other places in this region. I read an article a few weeks ago about the shortage of wheat for making bread in Egypt. It explained that Egypt should and could be the breadbasket of the region, but instead it now has to import 80% of its agricultural produce. The writer then went on to analyze why the country has got itself into this situation over the last few decades, and gave three main reasons. 1, farmers have given up growing wheat in order to grow crops that are more valuable and can be exported, like flowers, and have sold valuable farming land to developers. 2, the government has sold off land at knockdown prices to their own cronies, and have not built up the infrastructure to enable the country to feed itself. 3, the USA has encouraged the sale of its own wheat to Egypt instead of helping the country to be self-sufficient. Here's a justice issue that involves many parties. In Syria, approximately 10% of the population of 23 million, Christians are approximately 10% of the population, and because they are a minority, have felt quite close to the Assad regime, which is controlled by another minority, the Alawites, who are around 13%. Since the demonstrations started early in 2010, most Christians have remained loyal to Assad because they have seen him as the protector of the Christian community. The Sunnis have therefore been taunting the Christians, challenging them to come out on the streets and join the protests. At one stage, they were shouting in the streets, "Il-Alawiyya a'tabut, wal-Masihiyya a'Beirut." The Alawites to the coffin and the Christians to Beirut. Many inside and outside the country are very fearful about the fate of Christians if and when the Assad regime is forced out of power and Sunni Muslims of some kind take over the government. Have Syrian Christians perhaps been blind to the terrible injustices carried out over many years by a regime that has been authoritarian, repressive, and corrupt? Decades ago, some Christians in the West were shamed when they found that communists were more concerned about social justice than Christians were. Perhaps we should be shamed when we find that Islamists are sometimes more concerned about social justice than Christians are. Christians, of course, should have their own distinctive way of responding to injustice, which is summed up by Paul in the words, "Overcome evil with good." 10. Let's see Islamists and relate to them as people. I hope that all of us are aware of the work of Brother Andrew and his contacts with Islamists over many years. In 1992, he visited the 400 Palestinians who were expelled from Israel-Palestine and forced to camp in midwinter in tents on the mountains of South Lebanon. And since then, he and his friends have made regular visits to Hamas leaders in Gaza. Sami Awad has for several years been working with people in Hamas, exploring with them a genuinely Islamic basis for non-violence, peacemaking, and reconciliation. The point I want to emphasize is that here are people who have had the courage to go and meet Islamists face to face and build genuine relationships of trust with them. I hope that some of us at least are willing to follow their example, to overcome our fears and prejudices, to meet all kinds of Muslims face to face and speak with them heart to heart. And if we believe that Saul, the persecutor of the first Jewish believers in the Messiah, could meet the risen and ascended Christ on the road to Damascus, why can't we believe that God can find his own ways of breaking into the hearts and lives of Islamists in order to reveal Christ to them? And my conclusion, here are my suggestions about how we can, my suggestions about how we can begin to respond as Christians to radical Islam or Islamism. I trust that none of you will think that I am trying to be an advocate for Islamism or justify terrorism. What I've been trying to do is to demystify Islamism. It's a recent development, and I believe it is possible to explain where it comes from, where and how it has developed, and where it might be going. I'm trying to understand Islam and Islamism, and to get away from the demonization of Islam and the scaremongering that are so prevalent in the West, especially in our churches. I know that I shall be told that I'm naive, that I've gone soft on Islam and Islamism, and that I am much too optimistic about the prospect for Christians in the new Middle East after the Arab Spring. I know very well the saying, "Ba'd as-sabt yiji al-ahad," after Saturday comes Sunday. I know very well that some Islamists are deceitful and unscrupulous criminals. Others are bullies, strongmen who want to impose their will on Islam and Islam on others by force. Some of them have not yet learned that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, but I am not as pessimistic as some, because I believe that many Muslims do not want strongly Islamist governments, and that the younger generation who have taken to the streets are longing for greater freedom and a better economic future. The deepest longing of all devout Muslims is, let God be God. They want God to be honored in the public sphere, in society, in the state. Shouldn't that be the longing of every Christian as well? The longing that God's name should be respected and his kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. Christians don't agree with Muslims about how the kingly rule of God comes on earth, and we disagree strongly with Islamists over many issues. But let's at least try to understand them and not to bear false witness against them. to relate to them as people, to love them, and to live alongside them, to challenge them and engage in hard talk with them, and then perhaps to demonstrate by our actions that there may be another way.